The clinic smelled like citrus cleaner and new paper, a tidy, impersonal scent that Sophie had convinced herself felt safe. She had rehearsed the appointment in the mirror 3 times that morning: what to say, how to breathe, how to keep her hands from clenching the strap of her bag. The bell over the door of Hayes Women's Health wrenched the calm into a thin, acute note, a sound that made her heart skid the way it always did when someone new leaned too close to her world. He walked into the exam room with a measured confidence that felt almost anachronistic among the swivel chairs and laminated charts. Dr. Daniel Hayes was less the blinding, headline-ready figure she had expected from the photographs she'd seen in passing, the philanthropy gala photos, the hospital ribbon-cutting shots, than a man who wore his reputation like a coat he could take off in private. Up close, there was a softness to the set of his jaw. His hands, when they gestured, were careful. He introduced himself with a voice that did not hurry, and Sophie found that the practiced sentences she had rehearsed crumbled into something smaller and truer. "I know this is uncomfortable," he said after she had answered the routine questions, and his eyes, a steady hazel, held hers for a beat too long for a formal consultation. "We can go at whatever pace you need." It was only a small thing, the permission to move slower. For Sophie, it was a seam opening in a dress she had learned to button herself, an invitation where she had expected orders. She told herself, as she had told herself about almost everything, that she would be discreet, invisible. Her life was the smell of old paper and ink. She liked the quiet spaces inside pages where nothing demanded anything of her. Sitting across from Daniel, she realized she had cataloged every way to disappear and none that taught her how to stay. She noticed small details because she'd always had to: the way his coat fell on the chair, a faint scent, cedar, clean detergent. His watch caught the light. He listened, not only to what she said, but to what she didn't. Her hands, the way her foot tapped when she thought she wasn't tapping. When he explained the follow-up options, he did it in sentences that didn't assume competence or foolishness. He treated her as a person making a choice, not a thing in need of fixing. By the time the appointment ended, Sophie felt simultaneously elated and terrified. His kindness had been careful enough to keep the professional barrier intact, and yet there was an undercurrent of something else, an attention that made her cheeks spark with heat at certain angles. She told herself again that she would keep it contained. She signed the form, gathered her bag, and walked out into the mild November light, talking to herself in a voice that sounded like a stranger. "It's fine. It was just a consultation." Outside, for a breath, the city felt as if it were arranged in gentle tiers: the street, the bakery with its window fogged with steam, the little used bookstore where she worked, wandering displays into the late afternoon. She could have gone straight to the bus stop. Instead, she found her feet carrying her toward the narrow window of her shop, where the smell of dust and lemon polish welcomed her home. If you're into character-driven, true-feeling stories, give a thumbs up. In the days that followed, the memory of his measured voice settled under her skin like a soft ache. She told herself it would fade, but life delighted in offering reminders. The clinic's calendar had him slotted for the same hour every third Thursday. When Sophie opened the shop on those mornings, she felt the clock thicken. She told herself it wasn't anything. Still, on a Wednesday, she stepped out for air and found him by the cafe across from the clinic, stirring sugar into a paper cup. He smiled as if recognizing her, and for a ridiculous second, she wondered where her shop-worn bravery had gone. He did not approach. He lifted his cup in a small, careful nod and diverted his gaze as if to say, "I see you, but I won't cross the line." It was a gesture so mild it almost hurt more than boldness would have. Later she would understand it as the steady, quiet restraint of a man who lived inside policies and expectations as tightly as other people lived inside grief. They began to collide by accident and by tiny, courteous design. Once he walked past the bookshop window and hesitated as if deciding whether to enter. She closed the door on her hands and pretended she hadn't noticed. Another time, she caught him at the back of the store, just between the travel guides and the shelf of 19th-century poetry. He lingered over a worn copy of Frost because she had pulled one out to refold a page. "Good choice," he said, and she felt her face flame up as if she had been caught laughing in a church. He left without buying the book. Small things piled into a private mountain, inconspicuous texts, the shadow of his figure sitting several tables down when she took her lunch in the cafe. He left no footprints across her dignity, and yet made it harder for her to remain the same, invisible, contained, small. When she finally searched his name on her phone because curiosity, that dull, persistent tooth, gnawed at the edges of her day, the headlines struck with a shock. A picture of him cutting a ribbon at a new wing, another of him in a suit with a woman's smile said ease and ambition, a third article about a generous endowment to the city's maternal health initiative. His face, sharpened and public, could buy and build hospitals and give speeches. The numbers attached to his name were dizzying, gifts, donations, figures she couldn't parse. She scrolled too fast and then too slow, a voyeur of other people's light. She put the phone face down and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes until the headlines blurred into the dark behind them. It wasn't just that he was wealthy, it was a treacherous detail that rearranged the grammar of their small encounters. People who could give away hospitals did not pick over half-price paperbacks. They did not linger over fiction like an apology. Where did she fit in that equation? Could she be someone who deserved the attention behind his measured eyes? Or would she always be the woman in the cheap coat who had read the wrong book? He noticed when she pulled back. The next time she saw him, he behaved with the same careful kindness, but there was a new, honest caution in his face, an attorney's caution, perhaps. He did not ask about the bookstore anymore, and she was relieved and irritated in equal measure. She wanted to be ordinary, she wanted to be remarkable without the cost of his reticence. She flinched when he offered her a paper coffee on a rainy morning and turned it down. He kept the coffee and drank it alone. There was one sentence that changed the map between them, brief as a warning sign. She read it in the quiet band between instances, in an article that mentioned his name along with a line that felt like an explanation for the invisible leash she had been learning to pull against. Hospital counsel had advised Dr. Hayes to avoid personal contact beyond necessary care due to his public profile. It was a risk management directive meant to prevent conflicts of interest and protect patients from perceived influence. The sentence was flat and bureaucratic and carried the weight of law. It did not know he kept a photograph of a small boy grinning with a face full of a missing tooth in the second drawer of his desk. It did not know he had once been trusted with a life and had that trust blow apart when someone used his private kindness against him. To Sophie, it sounded like a decree, an order with the sterility of a satin ribbon. He wasn't even supposed to get personally involved. The admonition explained the distance. It did not make it less painful. Daniel had felt the order like a frost over his hands. He had been a doctor long before his name had begun to appear in the paper. The work had the kind of intimacy that ate at your edges if you let it. Public attention had not come overnight. It had arrived in the halting increments of volunteer appearances and grants, and then in a sudden small media orbit. His counsel's advice was sensible. High-profile clinicians learned quickly that everything intimate could be politicized. A handshake could become a headline. A bedside comfort could be misread and weaponized. He had, more than once, watched kindness be transmuted into accusation. His counsel had not told him he was cold or unfeeling. The directive had been pitched as necessary armor. The thing about directives, he had learned, was that they were blunt instruments applied to delicate human knots. Daniel could explain the rationale behind every box on the form. He could give the rationale as a speech, rehearsed and impersonal. He could say, with an apologetic tightness around the edges, that it was for the good of his patients and the clarity of his work. He could abide by the rule and watch people he liked drift away, which was a smaller grief compared to the disaster of an avoidable public breach. But his private measure of right did not always line up with the measure of policy. He had been told explicitly to keep his professional life separate from any personal entanglement with patients. The rule had been written across his calendar like a line he was not meant to cross. Yet there was a pixel of moral temperature that did not exist on paper. One evening, after 2 weeks of furtive exchanges that were always a degree too close to meaning, he read an email that mentioned her name inadvertently. Sophie Bennett, noted as a volunteer contact for a local literacy night. In the margin of the email, someone had scribbled a note for his assistant suggesting an invitation, emphasizing community reach. The handwriting looked almost kind in its anonymity. Daniel stared at the screen and understood the improbable cruelty of the world, that a life could be both public and tiny, that anonymity could turn into embarrassment with the flip of a context. He closed the laptop and sat for a long time. He began to change his strategy. Instead of pushing outward, he shrank his gestures into smaller acts of constancy. He left a receipt for a coffee outside her shop with a polite note tucked beneath. "If you need a slower pace, I will keep my distance. D." She didn't reply. He told himself it was okay. The whole point of his life had been to learn to respect boundaries, even when the heart was a noisy brute. Sophie had reasons that extended beyond headlines. She had been hurt before, though not by an owner of hospitals or a philanthropist. Hurt had been a small, quiet thing that had layered itself into her posture. A teacher who had once said she'd be teaching the wrong subject forever. A boyfriend who had chosen convenience over presence. Hurt taught her to count the cost of smiles. Firsts had become terrifying. To accept the attention of someone like Daniel felt like stepping from a narrow footbridge into a canyon where the echo might be cruel. Her small world of dust-muffled cardboard boxes and people who liked their coffee bitter had been a practice in modest living. She loved the shop because it required her to show up for small things only, arranging a display, recommending a comfort read to a regular, laughing politely at a customer's eccentricities. The shop was a place where her trembling could be hidden behind the ritual of returning books to their rightful shelves. For a time, that was the kind of life she thought she deserved. But life has a way of rearranging the furniture. Early one late October afternoon, when rain traced fragile patterns down the window and the shop smelled clean with lemon, she took a shortcut across the busy intersection to grab a new box of bookmarks. She had both hands full, cardboard clutched against her chest like a shield, and the bus shelter's plastic roof thrummed with wet. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest that suggested she should breathe differently, and the world narrowed to the hiss of tires and the small bell of the shop's door she always heard in memory. She didn't notice the fever at first, just a heat that sat behind her eyes and made the sound of the world too bright. On the street, her vision tilted. The faces of people widened and then receded like tide marks on sand. Her knees trembled. The cardboard slipped and fell. Someone laughed at a private joke nearby. Sophie's breath came shallow and clumsy. She wasn't thinking. She was suddenly a body that wanted only to fold into itself. When she hit the pavement, the world snapped, sharp as a photograph. Pain exploded behind her ears and then vanished. For a few drifting seconds, she lay with the sky spooling clean blue above her and felt the press of wet on her cheek. Rain or sweat, she couldn't tell. Panic was a bright animal behind her ribs. She heard the clatter of a dropped umbrella and the slap of a shoe. People leaned away as if the sound of catastrophe might make them catch it. She had no presence of mind to worry about who was watching until she heard a voice call her name, and the syllables split through the rain like a rope. "Sophie!" It was his voice. Up close, it was not the controlled monologue of a man used to giving media statements. It was immediate and human, and it moved through her in a current that made her lungs betray her with a hot, ragged cough. Daniel had been walking down the sidewalk toward his car when he saw her collapse. Time did that odd thing in emergencies where it both sprinted and slowed, impossibly quick to the scene, impossibly slow in the first sharp observations. He moved as a doctor moves. Check the airway, look for breathing, speak loudly enough to be heard, but not to startle. He knelt. Rain soaked his cuffs and the hem of his coat. He didn't reach for a pair of gloves. He didn't think about getting his hands wet. The human part of him, one trained to touch and trained to assess, took over like a muscle remembered. "Sophie, can you hear me?" His voice folded over her. He placed a cool hand at her temple. She flinched as if he had burned her. Her fingers, damp and small, fumbled for his wrist, as if to anchor herself to something that would not let go. "Help is on the way," he told her, and at once he reached for his phone with the other hand. He dialed with one thumb, voice clipped and efficient into the receiver. "I need EMS to the intersection of West 3rd and Maple." Female, mid-20s, sudden collapse. He described the scene clinically because he must have age, location, consciousness. He said the word syncope, not because he wanted to have the authority, but because the language men like him shared made the chaos smaller. He listened to the dispatcher, relayed information. He told the dispatcher that he was a physician on scene, and then added, perhaps out of equal parts stubbornness and law, "I'll stay with her until EMS arrives." The line in his inbox about counsel's directive flickered through his head with the bright, useless clarity of a memorized phrase. He had been told in no uncertain terms to avoid personal contact beyond necessary care. This was necessary care, he thought, and in quiet private he added the caveat, "and I will document and inform administration." He would write down every second, every word. He would not bend the rules without transparency. He would not let the policy be his excuse to do nothing. People gathered at the edges like a slow curtain. An older man muttered about the traffic. A woman wrapped a scarf more tightly, as if warmth could avert calamity. Someone shouted for water. Daniel answered with practical commands. "Give me your jacket, please," he said to a man at his shoulder, and used it to prop Sophie's head. He checked for a pulse, the beat quick and frightened, then found it at an odd flutter. Her skin was cool and clammy, but there was fever in the set of her jaw. He asked her questions in short sentences because confusion responds better to simplicity. "What's your name? Tell me your name." She blinked, trying to gather the film over her eyes. "Sophie," she said, like one saying a secret. He repeated it soft, grounding the sound there beside her. He kept his tone businesslike but kind, the two not mutually exclusive. He could feel in an old part of his chest the loosened tension that always arrived in crisis, the clarity that came when life reduced itself to the next right act. A passerby knelt and offered a bottle of water. Daniel took a cup, coaxed the liquid across Sophie's lips in tiny sips, watching the reflexes of swallow and gag. She coughed and then breathed easier. It was a small victory, the kind that could be stamped down into a chart later as responsive to stimuli and improved with oral fluids. He checked her pupils, the way he had been taught to do 1,000 times in rooms where the lights were too bright and families watched from doorways. He kept talking to her because sound was a tether. When the siren arrived, it sounded like a blade dividing the air. The EMTs leapt from their vehicle with practiced choreography. Daniel rose to the background, supplying the facts with an economy that made the EMT, young with a ponytail damp with rain, nod. Syncope, Possible dehydration, fever, he relayed. Patient responded to oral fluids, no obvious head trauma. He answered the EMT's questions precisely. History, vitals he had taken in the small, informal way a doctor does on the street. He made careful notations in his head, as if composing the paragraph he would later commit to a report. Everything had to be transparent. The EMTs moved with a steady assurance that said this was not their first collapse. They introduced themselves, asked for permission to examine, explained each step. Sophie watched them like a small island in a widening ocean. She turned her face, pale, mascara smudged, toward Daniel. For a moment, the world narrowed to the two of them and the rain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, a sentence that meant more in its smallness than the apology could ever account for. He put a finger lightly under her chin and shook his head. The touch was not invasive. It belonged to the part of him that was a doctor, not the part that catalogued headlines. "Don't apologize," he said. "You did nothing wrong." The ambulance straps were cinched with a mechanical efficiency. Someone had asked her, gently, if she wanted to go to the ER. She had said yes, as if consenting to something inevitable. As they prepared to lift the gurney, Daniel hesitated. He felt the tug of policy at the back of his neck, a thin thread that said, "No personal attachments." He looked at Sophie then, the flutter of her eyelids, the small tremor of her hand, and made a choice he had practiced in thought, sometimes at night, like a prayer. He followed the stretcher into the ambulance, but in the way a citizen might follow, and not the way a treating physician would. He rode beside her like someone who knew what might happen and wanted to be present in a strictly human capacity. He told the EMTs plainly, "I will document and inform hospital administration. I'm here to ensure continuity until you transfer care." That sentence was both confession and contract, an admission that he had been close enough to care intimately, and a promise that he would not pretend the act had no consequence. He was not breaking rules in the fanciful way of melodrama. He was acknowledging a boundary and promising to follow the right procedural steps afterwards. In his head, a file began to take shape: time, actions taken, witnesses, clinical findings. He would hand it to the appropriate office. He would not let the story be simplified or weaponized by omission. Sophie did not ask why he had followed. Perhaps she understood, in the small private way that people do in sudden intimacy, that a person chooses to help because they cannot not help. Her fingers curled once around his knuckles where they rested on the rail. It was a fragile claim. "Thank you," she breathed. He squeezed back, a brief, steady pressure that said, "We are not the same as the headlines." He wanted to say more, so much more, but the ambulance's siren shrieked and the doors closed. For a pulse beat, the world outside the ambulance was a smear of wet and faces and traffic.
Then the vehicle slid toward the hospital, and everything that had been simmering took on the flavor of consequence. Inside the ambulance, the EMTs worked with an efficient, calm rhythm. Monitors beeped, a blood pressure cuff compressed and released. Daniel passed along what he had observed so far and wrote, in the neatness of his mind, the phrases a doctor uses when facts must be laid like stones. Syncope likely secondary to dehydration. Fever present. No focal neurological deficit on focused exam. The reality of his action would have to be accounted for later. For now, the imperative was care. Sophie drifted between awareness and a sleep that was not restful. When she opened her eyes, it was to the hard fluorescent brightness of the emergency department and a stringent white that made the color drop from her cheeks. The room smelled different here, antiseptic undercut with the metallic tang of machines. Nurses asked questions that made no sense: insurance, allergies, and Sophie answered with fragmented words. The doctor on duty, efficient and competent, introduced himself and asked the same baseline queries Daniel had answered in the street. Daniel stood respectfully aside, offering information when asked, letting the team do their job. At some point, between the triage and the IV, between the stethoscope and the lab slip, someone in administration, an officer trained to see patterns that made other people vaguely uncomfortable, would have a conversation with Daniel about documentation. He expected the call, the note, the gentle but firm reminder of policy. He did not expect the private, intrusive worry he felt at the thought of a file being opened about him, that the man who once had only ever wanted to help might be interpreted as having stepped outside a line drawn for his protection. As the nurses prepared the little plastic wedge of paperwork that accompanies every patient, Sophie watched Daniel with a slow, bewildered gratitude. She realized with a jolt that a person could exist publicly and be tender privately, that a man who could have used his influence to make an appointment appear on her doorstep instead knelt on a rainy sidewalk and held the corner of her life long enough to steady it. The arithmetic of power never balanced itself simply. It folded into a more complicated shape that felt less like purchase and more like an offering. When the doctor who had been assigned to her delivered the initial impression, likely dehydration and viral fever, we will run blood work and monitor, Daniel made his small procedural note aloud, and then, without fanfare, moved toward the door to give the staff space. He turned at the threshold and looked at her for a split second, the look of someone holding a question in his jaw. "Can I wait in the visitors' area?" he asked, a man who knew institutional rules and was pleading without being melodramatic. Sophie tried to speak, but the sentence lodged behind something like a taste. Finally, she nodded. "Please," she said, and the word was an offering of consent. He walked to the visitors' area as requested by a nurse, polite, unobtrusive, and sat with his hands folded, attention threaded like a wire back toward her bed. In the corner of the room, a TV played without sound, an image of a talk show host laughing at something trivial. Above everything else, the attendant hum of medical machinery kept time. There would be a conversation soon between him and the hospital administration, a cataloging of who was present and why. He knew that there were administrative eyes that would file this as a potential boundary issue. He anticipated the email asking for his statement before it arrived. That anticipation was not avoidance, it was responsibility. Sophie watched him as if she were reading a book she had once thought herself unworthy to keep on the shelf. He didn't glare at the television or check his phone often. He simply sat with the patient economy of a person who had chosen to stay. In the gap between the beats of her fear, the thought slid through her like a beam of light. He had been ordered not to help her. He did it anyway. There was a quiet gravity to that truth. It wasn't the romantic notion of rebellion. It was the quieter, more complicated thing, a clinician weighing a policy against the immediate ethical imperative to do the next right thing. That calculus had landed him beside her on the wet sidewalk and inside the ambulance, and now in a chair in the hospital's waiting area. It was a mercy measured in small increments, hands, words, presence, rather than headlines and big gestures. When an orderly came by to tell them the doctor would have to run through a few more tests and that visitors had limited access, Daniel rose with the practiced courtesy of someone who knew how to bend in institutions. He came over to the bed, kneeling on one knee to lower himself to her level. It was not a dramatic gesture, it was a practical one. He looked down at her with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with his public self and everything to do with the person in the bed. "Sophie," he said, as if the name were something to be protected rather than uttered carelessly. "I'm going to make sure everything's documented. I will inform administration that I was present and that care was transferred. I won't overstep. I promise you that." She understood the promise contained both of protection and of prudence. It mattered to her that he said, "I will document," because the act of documentation itself was a kind of honesty, an accounting that said, "I was here,
I will not pretend otherwise, and when the system demands answers, my answers will be the truth." She reached out a hand and touched the back of his wrist. For a person who had habituated herself to solitude, the gesture felt like a prayer. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not leaving." He gave a half-smile, worn and private. "Of course," he replied. The word was soft and absolute. It was a small, honest thing in a world that often tried to make honesty into a headline. They both knew the rules were still in place, that the directive from council was a living thing that would need a response. He knew, too, that whatever paperwork awaited would not erase the fact of his presence. She knew that a line had been crossed in a way that was not romantic intrusion, but a human response to a collapsing person. They had created a new fact by being honest with each other and with the system. He would document, he would step back if required. The choice he had made to help had been immediate and humane, but not lawless. There would be consequences in forms and emails, perhaps a conversation with an administrator who spoke the language of risk. He had in his own mind already planned to accept whatever came, because the act of helping had not been an abandonment of the rules. It had been an application of them to the messy reality of life. Sophie closed her eyes, the IV line a strange coolness at her arm. The steady beeping of the monitor was like distant rain. The ER smelled of bleach and hope and the latent fear that lives in places meant to mend. Outside, the city continued without pause. Inside, time felt like a held breath. When the first tendrils of sleep pulled at her, she felt his hand brush hers, quick as a promise. "I'll be downstairs," he said, voice low. "I'll wait until you're settled." "Okay," she whispered, letting her eyes fall shut. He left as if respecting the fragile law of the room, but also with the slow certainty of someone who knew he would be back if needed. He made the kind of exit that a man trained in discipline would make, measured, accountable, and honest. He moved like a man who had been ordered not to help, and yet could not unsee the world when a person he had come to care for collapsed before him. He had chosen to act, and he had chosen to make that action transparent. The first part of the story closed with the ambulance doors shutting and the hum of the ER machines rising. There was a sense of something having begun as certainly as it had stopped, a sequence of choices that would need to be explained, bound by procedure and also by a quiet human stubbornness. The rain on the hospital windows blurred the city into a watercolor of lights. Inside, a woman slept, fever cooling, and a man sat with the weight of a decision that might change both of their lives. The administrative directive was a line, clearly written. His words to the nurse were a promise of accountability. Between them lay the rest of the conversation, formalities and confessions, rules and the slow, careful building of trust. He left the waiting area with the sort of deliberate lightness people learn to carry when they know their choices will be scrutinized. The hospital's risk management office would need his statement. His inbox would fill with polite requests for a timeline. He had half a dozen forms already drafted in his head, dates, times, the names of witnesses, and he turned them into actual words that night at his kitchen table, the apartment quiet except for the city muffled beyond the windows. He wrote what had happened, precisely and plainly. Found patient collapsed, provided immediate care, handed off to EMS, rode an ambulance as a witness and to ensure continuity, transferred care to ED team, documented findings. He added the line he knew would matter most. He would recuse himself from any further clinical involvement. Hospital Council's directive had been not vague. The risk management team had advised Dr. Hayes to avoid personal contact with patients beyond necessary care because of his public profile. It was a reasonable, bureaucratic precaution. He had followed it insofar as he could until the ambulance doors closed. Then he had acted like the man who had learned to put another's life ahead of his own reputation. Sophie woke with the taste of metal in her mouth and a stitched memory. Bright white lights, the scrape of a gurney, Daniel's voice. She blinked in the pale hospital light and found him in the waiting area's small window of visibility, his figure a silhouette between chairs. When the nurse announced she could have visitors, his face tightened in a way she knew was not showy. There was a tension that radiated from him now, like someone bearing a knapsack of forms and explanations. He sat beside the bed as if taking his place at a table. There was nothing performative in the way he smoothed the edge of the blanket or asked the nurse if there was a recommended room temperature. His attentions were small, domestic, and precise. He had called ahead to let them know he would be present in a visitor capacity and handed an account of the emergency to charge nurse before saying more than a few words to Sophie. That exchange, short, honest, felt important to both of them. "Sophie," he said, watching the way she turned her face toward him the way one might turn toward a lighthouse in fog. The blood work was mostly reassuring. You have a viral fever, probably exacerbated by dehydration. The little IV will help with fluids. We'll keep you for observation overnight, then discharge if everything looks stable." She let out a breath that might have been a laugh had she felt stronger. "Will I be okay?" He leaned forward, folding his hands into something like an anchor. "Yes. Rest, fluids, follow up with your primary care in a few days. If the fever spikes or you feel lightheaded again, go back. I'll make sure the staff gives you a clear discharge plan." He said that last part as an offering and as a boundary. He meant it. He would make sure she left with information, with another physician assigned for any follow-up. He would not be the one to call the prescriptions or manage her ongoing care. He had already set the gears in motion to transfer responsibility to the ED physician on duty and to a colleague in primary care who could accept her as a new patient if she wished. He repeated things like a pledge: transparency, documentation, recusal. Her gaze softened. The hospital light made his eyes a flat, steady color. She knew, with a clarity that felt almost brutal, that his presence had been ethical because he had immediately involved the team and because he was treating the administrative consequences like part of the medicine. She reached for a small courage and said, "Why did you stay? You're a public figure. You could have called it in and gone home." He did not answer with a headline. He answered with the kind of truth that sits outside of public narratives. "Because you were on the pavement," he said. "Because someone needs to be there when another person folds in front of them. Council's directive exists for a reason. I respect it. But there are also moments when a person collapses and what they need first is simple human help. That was the choice I made. I documented everything and I will accept any administrative response." There it was, a man who wielded both humility and accountability. She watched him, this man who had been photographed at gala dinners and who also knew intimately how to tie a triangular bandage around a child's wrist, and felt the strange tilt of gratitude and embarrassment. "People like you don't kneel," she said, the sentence small and raw. "Not the way you did." He blinked, and for a moment she saw the shadow beneath the light, the residue of a past taught by public exposure. "I used to think that was true," he admitted, "and then someone turned a private kindness into a thing that could be sold. It made me cautious in the way people who get burned learn to be cautious, slow to trust, quick to formalize. That's why counsel exists. It wasn't about me being cold. It was about protecting patients and protecting the work." He did not expand into the messy specifics, no gossip, no lurid detail, only a recognition that someone's past had translated into policy. Sophie heard the outline: a kindness exploited, a reputation bruised, a lesson turned into defense. It made his present delicacy make sense. They talked in the thin hospital hours about smaller things, the kind of talk that stitches two strangers into a shared map. He asked about the bookstore, how the shop smelled in October, which author she was returning to again and again. She told him about a regular who always asked for poetry by the pound, and a stray cat that liked to sit by the poetry shelf. He laughed in a way that was private and not for press photographers, and the sound made something soften in her chest. There was a moment when she searched his face the way she might search the spine of a book for a title. "Are you allowed to be here with me?" she asked. It was practical as much as it was vulnerable. He took a breath that held both candor and care. "I informed the staff. I handed in a statement. I will not be your treating physician. If you prefer, I can make sure another doctor follows up. I will not overstep." He watched her weigh the answer. "If you want me to wait in the visitors area, I'll do that. If you want me to leave, I'll go." Sophie surprised herself by choosing the middle. "Stay," she said, "for a little while." He stayed, and when she slept that afternoon, feverish and fragile, she dreamed of rain on the bookstore window and a man whose hands did not intimidate her, but held the smallness of her. She woke to his voice asking for the nurse and a cup of tepid tea. He had become, in the beat between event and consequence, a person who treated the administrative aftermath as carefully as he had treated her pulse. When the administrator called the next morning, they spoke as professionals who had seen the margins of life and were obligated to make sense of them. Daniel answered every question. He described the steps he had taken, the witnesses, the transfer of care. He offered to meet with counsel in person and to sign whatever documentation they required. The risk management officer thanked him and said the conversation was routine. They appreciated that he had been transparent. There might be, the officer said, a cursory note in his file, merely as record. He expected something sterner, an inquiry, a reminder of expectations, but instead there was a precise institutional relief. The institution had a process for people in news cycles and men like him who lived in the limelight. He had used that process rather than hide behind an immediate, unaccounted-for intimacy. The formality did not feel like vindication as much as it felt like a necessary accounting. He had acted humanely and then submitted himself to the rules that governed his public life. When Sophie was discharged late the next day, she left with instructions and a paper folder that smelled of toner and care plans. Daniel walked her to the door of the hospital and then, on instinct, paused, uncertain where the line between hospital and world now lay. The rain had stopped, and the city air was a bright, clean thing. "Do you want me to walk you home?" he asked, the offer gentle. She hesitated, picturing the tidy shop and the stack of returns. "Only if you promise not to buy the whole chain of bookstores and make me feel poor," she said, lightness threading her voice. He smiled. "No purchases, just steps." They walked past the bakery with its fogged glass and the cafe that smelled like espresso and lemon tarts. People brushed past them, anonymous in their errands. Sophie felt the quiet stir that comes when life has tilted and the ground is remacked. She had been ill, and someone had knelt for her in the street. She had been offered a kind of attention she had never asked for, and perhaps had never permitted herself to receive. Over the following weeks, the relationship that grew between them did so without fireworks or sudden declarations. Daniel respected the boundary he had promised. He did not text hourly updates about her recovery. He did not make appointments to be her clinician. He continued to attend to the hospital as a public servant, to lecture at conferences, to sign grant letters. But his presence in her life was the sort of steady thing that accumulated weight. A folded note left in the bookshop's recirculation box that read simply, "Hope you're feeling better, D." A volunteer night at the city library where fair-haired children folded into his lap for a story he read like it mattered. an invitation to a modest community literacy event where he knelt next to Sophie as she organized the donation table and offered to hold the stack of bookmarks while she tied the ribbon. He refused extravagance, no showy gifts, no headline-seeking gestures. Instead, he learned her rituals, the way she arranged the poetry section on Thursdays, the scritch of her pen when she annotated book plates, the exact hour she closed the shop to sweep the crumbs out from under the counter. He asked for permission before small kindnesses. May I bring you soup? May I sit with you at the reading? May I call if you feel dizzy? He recorded these things in quiet ways. He continued to document what mattered professionally and personally. When they spoke about his counsel's directive, he framed it not as an accusation, but as a tool he'd learned to respect. "The rule keeps us both safe," he said once, "but it doesn't make leaving people alone the right choice when someone's life is at stake." Sophie tested the edges of these new boundaries. She worried sometimes that the world might be shorter than it felt, that when his name surfaced in the paper, it would fold their smallness into an editorial narrative. She had a fear that love might be something he could perform and then retreat from. He answered those fears with the kind of attention that is not dramatic but cumulative. He showed up at a launch for the literacy initiative she ran, not as the donor in the ribbon photo, but as the man who had brought coffee for volunteers and who asked about the slow volunteer from the nursing home because he remembered her name. He declined photographs, preferring to stand at the back and listen. There were nights when they sat in the back of the bookstore after closing, the world turned soft by lamplight. Sophie would read aloud, a passage from Frost or an essay that made her feel braver, and he would listen the way a person listens to music that will live inside their chest. One night, while a rain traced slow lines down the window, she paused and said simply, "Why me?" He set the book aside and looked at her with a seriousness that was steady rather than theatrical. "Because," he said, "you read books like someone reads people. You're careful with what you keep and generous with what you give away."
I admire that. Also, because when you collapsed, I could do nothing else but help. Her laugh was half surprise and half something like relief. "That's not an answer," she said. "It is the truth," he replied. "And it's also the beginning of an answer." The beginning stretched into months. They learned each other's habits, her tendency to avoid the phone when anxious, his habit of rereading the same paragraph until it made sense. They navigated the inevitable awkward moment when a reporter arrived at the bookstore for a feel-good piece on community literacy and recognized Daniel in the doorway. He stepped forward to clarify that he was there as a volunteer, not as a spokesperson, and he introduced Sophie as the organizer of the event. The reporter turned the story into one about the city's grassroots work rather than about the man who funded it. Sophie felt oddly vindicated that the story was about the work and not about his name alone. Their romance moved without rush. It did not begin with dramatic proclamations or with someone forsaking a duty. It began after documentation and recusal, and after Sophie had been under the hospital staff and a primary physician who agreed to see her for follow-up. It began with a mutual permission. He had fulfilled his obligations to the system. She was no longer his patient under ongoing treatment. They were two consenting adults, gradually inventing a language together. When the first time they kissed arrived, it was neither a scene for headlines nor a breach of boundaries. It was in the back room of the bookstore, amid stacks of unsorted returns. A music box, some melodramatic thing Sophia had rescued from a clearance bin, played a nostalgic tune. Their hands brushed over a stack of book plates. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the worry that had inhabited their early days, the worry that proximity would be mistaken for purchase, fell away like old cloth. The kiss was brief, respectful, and astonishing in how non-performative it felt. When it ended,
They both laughed in a way that had a relief to it. There were administrative echoes, an annual performance review for him that included a line about upholding institutional standards, a friendly letter from a hospital administrator noting the completeness of his documentation. There were acquaintances who raised eyebrows and old colleagues who asked guardrail questions about how he navigated such situations. He answered all of them with the same calm honesty he had cultivated. I acted to provide immediate care. I let the system know. I recused myself from further medical involvement. The patient consented to social contact only after discharge and with full knowledge of our prior interaction. The record was clean, and the record-keeping was meticulous. It was, in many ways, an ordinary administrative tale turned remarkable only because of how a single moment made two people's lives intersect. As their confidence in each other grew, Sophie found herself daring to accept more of the world. She applied to host a monthly reading night at the library. She said yes to a radio interview about the joy of second-hand books. Her fortress of modesty did not fall. It widened to include a man who, while wealthy, did not attempt to replace the smallness she cherished. He invested in the literacy programs not as a savior, but as a partner, and he listened when she suggested where funding would do the most good rather than where his name might be most visible. One afternoon in late spring, when the chestnut trees along the avenue were unfurling new leaves and the bakery's windows smelled like cardamom, Daniel asked her to meet him at the cafe across from the clinic, the place where, months earlier, she had first seen him stirring sugar into a paper cup and felt both seen and guarded. They sat at the table by the window, the same table he'd once occupied at a precise distance. This time there was no consumer camera and no ribbon to cut, only a cup of tea each and the soft hum of other people's ordinary conversations. He reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. She felt the old, familiar flutter, an echo of fear and a new glint of hope. He did not get down on one knee as if reciting a dramatized promise. He opened the box with a deliberate tenderness and showed a simple ring, a narrow band of gold, not ostentatious, set with a tiny stone that caught the light like a promise kept small. "Sophie," he said, his voice steady, "you taught me how to be patient in a way the papers never could. You've shown me how to find joy in the quiet. I want to choose you, not because I can, but because I want to. I will never use my resources to buy your affection. I will only use them to build the world you believe in. Will you marry me?" The question was a sort of map. It invited her into a future that balanced his capacity with her values. Sophie felt all the reasons she had feared love: inequity, exposure, the worry that headlines could swallow tender things, stack, and then dissolve beneath a different ledger. Choose because choose. She thought of the man who had knelt on the rain-slicked pavement and called an ambulance. She thought of the quiet volunteer nights and the way he had never, even once, made her less than herself. "Yes," she said. It was small, but it was the word that unfolded into everything. She put the ring on, and it sat there like a hinge between two lives that had found their way, slowly and carefully, into common ground. They did not pretend the world was suddenly simple. There would still be forms and disclosures and counsel's memos. There would still be interviews and people who read headlines for a living. But the difference now was not in what they could buy or what headlines they might generate. It was in the ordinary, private ledger of mutual care. He would continue to recuse himself from her medical care if it ever became relevant. She would continue to lead her shop and savor the small rituals that made her life meaningful. Together, they would show that generosity and restraint could coexist. On the day of the little engagement celebration, Sophie placed a copy of Frost's poems at the top of a stack and slipped inside its pages the sort of handwritten note she had once thought herself undeserving of. For the man who learns to keep his hands clean and his heart open. Daniel read it later, sitting on a bench under the chestnut trees, and for a moment the city hushed around him. When the story of their meeting reached the paper months later, framed as a human interest piece about community literacy and unexpected connections, it told the truth without turning anything into spectacle. It described a man who had followed a duty and then a heart that had followed him home. It described a woman who had returned to the shop and found her life enlarged without feeling invaded. It mentioned the hospital's council directive and how both parties had met the administrative obligations. It did not need to sell scandal because the truth was already delicate and more powerful, a choice made in public but accounted for in private. On quiet evenings, they returned to the bookstore and sat beneath the soft lamp. Sophie would run her fingers along spines and sometimes close her eyes, listening to him read a paragraph aloud. He would look at her not as a story to be told, but as a person whose smallness and bravery had rearranged his life for the better. If Sophie had learned anything from that autumn day, when rain and panic had folded her into a stranger's hands, it was that help could be given with honesty, and that love could be won without theatrics. If Daniel had learned anything, it was that any policy sharp enough to protect could also be complemented by a heart willing to be accountable. They had both been ordered by lines written to keep things clean. They had chosen, together, to make a messy human life into something carefully tended. If Sophie and Daniel's story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe.